Usually when you hold up a $20 bill to the light, there is this expectation of objective verification. Like you look for the watermark.
Right. You check for that embedded security thread, the little strip.
Exactly. And the cashier just nods. It's a moment of shared reality between you and the person across the counter.
Yeah, it's a binary transaction.
Yeah.
It's either authentic tender or it's a counterfeit piece of paper. There's no middle ground where the bill's value is based on his personal feelings.
Right. And that verification is deeply comforting. We like to know that when we touch a wooden table, it's solid. We like to know that when we spend $1, the entire world agrees on what that dollar is actually worth.
But we are looking at a modern landscape right now where that verification light is entirely shattered. I mean, completely broken.
Yeah, we are surrounded by a world completely submerged in manufactured illusions. And that is really the absolute core of today's mission on the Morning Roundup. Every day, we take the day's most fascinating, controversial, and honestly sometimes baffling sources. Articles, videos, deep dive research. We distill their key insights and we weave them together into a single narrative for you.
And today's stack of sources is incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
I mean, we are parsing through quantum physics scams, global central banking power struggles, modern identity politics inside middle schools.
Which is wild audio, by the way.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Plus the rewriting of ancient Greek epics, government UFO psychological operations, and explosive geopolitical warfare.
But the thematic through line connecting every single one of those seemingly unrelated topics is this battle between objective reality and manufactured illusions.
Exactly. We are living in this bizarre historical moment where institutions, powerful individuals, and even our technology are trying to just, conjure reality out of thin air.
Right. And we are going to look at raw arguments today from across the political, cultural, and spiritual spectrum. No hand-holding, no caveats, and definitely no taking sides.
Yeah, we are just here to show you the architecture of these arguments and help you figure out how to anchor yourself when everything around you feels like a mirage.
So, to understand how a society begins to manufacture cultural illusions, you really first have to look at how they try to manufacture physical resources, right?
Definitely. The desire to cheat the fundamental laws of nature usually precedes the desire to cheat the fundamental laws of society.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a source from the physicist Sabine Hassenfelder regarding a company called Casimir Inc.
Right, this is fascinating.
Now, this company, led by a former NASA scientist named Harold White, just raised $12 million from venture capitalists.
$12 million for something that, well, violates basic physics.
Right. Their core claim is that they have built a microchip that harvests continuous, unlimited energy from the quantum vacuum using something called the Casimir effect.
Yeah, they are literally pitching this to investors as the world's first unlimited power supply.
The audacity of that pitch is just breathtaking, mainly because they are weaponizing a real scientific phenomenon to sell what is essentially a complete thermodynamic illusion.
Right, because the Casimir effect itself is a well-documented reality in quantum field theory. I mean, it's a real thing.
Can you explain that real quick for the listeners?
Sure. So if you place two uncharged metal plates incredibly close together in a perfect vacuum, and we're talking micrometers apart here,
Yeah.
they will naturally attract each other.
Right. I remember reading about this. It has to do with quantum fluctuations, doesn't it? The idea that empty space isn't actually empty, it's bubbling with these virtual particles popping in and out of existence.
That is the popular visualization, yeah. The more precise way to describe it is that the physical presence of those two plates restricts the available electromagnetic modes in the gap between them.
Okay, so like they block certain waves from fitting in there.
Exactly. Because there are fewer vacuum fluctuations allowed between the plates than outside the plates, it effectively creates an inward pressure. The plates are pushed together.
So it results in a highly measurable, albeit microscopic, attractive force.
Right. But here's the catastrophic flaw in Casimir Inc.'s $12 million pitch. The Casimir effect is a ground state.
Meaning it's at the absolute bottom of the energy hill. You can't fall any further to generate power.
Precisely. It is, by definition, the state of the lowest possible energy in that system. To get energy out of the attraction of those plates, you first have to put energy in to pull them apart and set up the system in the first place.
So you are not extracting energy from the vacuum at all. You are just retrieving a fraction of the mechanical energy you used to build the microstructure.
Yeah, exactly. Furthermore, Casimir Inc. claims they are siphoning electrons that are tunneling into the gap to create a continuous electrical current.
But if an electron tunnels into a ground state, it doesn't voluntarily leave, does it?
No, it has nowhere lower to go. There is no continuous current because the system achieves equilibrium instantly.
But hold on, let me play the stubborn investor for a second here. They claim they actually measured a physical electrical output.
Yeah, they did.
They explicitly told a tech publication they were getting millivolts to volts at picoamp current levels. I mean, you can't fake a reading on a voltmeter, can you?
Well, you don't have to fake the reading. You just have to misattribute where it's coming from.
Oh, interesting. So what are they actually measuring then?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the picoamp is 10 to the negative 12th of an amp. It is an infinitesimally small number. If you calculate the total power output they're claiming, it's roughly 10 picowatts.
And Sabine Hossenfelder makes a brilliant point here, right? She says you can extract a picowatt of energy from practically any tiny microscopic deviation from equilibrium in a normal room.
Exactly.
Wait, if I'm driving to work right now listening to this, I'm probably wondering what kind of ambient noise creates a picowatt.
Think about it this way. If you hold a completely dead AA battery in your hand, the microscopic temperature difference between your skin and the ambient air in the room is generating more thermal energy than these quantum guys are claiming to pull from the fabric of the universe.
Oh, wow. So just holding a dead battery creates more power.
Yeah. Thermal gradients, tiny humidity shifts, or even the contact potential difference that naturally occurs when you touch two dissimilar metals together in a circuit. All of these generate picowatts of background noise.
So it has absolutely nothing to do with extracting infinite energy from a quantum vacuum.
Nothing at all. You can extract a picowatt from the warmth of a desk lamp, but you can never ever scale that up to a kilowatt. The underlying energy source simply does not exist.
So what does this all mean? It sounds to me like they built a highly sensitive thermometer, called it a perpetual motion machine, wrapped it up in quantum buzzwords, and cashed a $12 million check.
That's a pretty accurate summary.
But the much bigger and honestly more concerning question is this. Why are institutional investors so willing to throw millions at literal magic? Is our societal desperation for clean energy totally overriding basic high school physics?
It's the psychological allure of getting something from nothing.
Right.
When a society feels constrained by the harsh, unforgiving realities of resource scarcity and thermodynamics, the promise of a magical escape hatch becomes incredibly lucrative.
People want to believe in infinite resources so badly, they will literally turn off their critical thinking.
Yeah, and we see this exact same vulnerability, this desperate desire to conjure something out of thin air, playing out on a much larger scale in global finance.
Which is the perfect bridge to our next source, Heresy Financial. Because if the quantum engineers are trying to pull infinite energy out of a physical vacuum, the central bankers are trying to pull infinite liquidity out of a financial vacuum.
That's a great way to frame it. The Heresy Financial analysis focuses on a historic anomaly currently unfolding at the Federal Reserve.
We are witnessing a massive leadership shift right now.
Yes. Jerome Powell's tenure as Fed chair is scheduled to end, and the incoming administration has signaled that Kevin Warsh will be stepping in.
However, Powell is doing something that breaks, what, a 75-year tradition?
Yeah, roughly 75 years. He is refusing to resign his governorship.
Which is wild. Outgoing Fed chairs historically leave the board entirely to let the new chair govern, right? But Powell is vowing to stay in his seat.
And the source claims he's doing this as a defensive maneuver because the incoming Trump administration has launched a criminal investigation into Powell's handling of the Federal Reserve's headquarters renovations.
But the argument from Heresy Financial is that this investigation isn't actually about building permits or contractor bids at all.
No, not at all. The source argues it is a brutal political pressure tactic designed to force Powell to rapidly lower interest rates, and Powell is stubbornly digging his heels in to maintain the Fed's independence.
To understand the mechanics of why this power struggle is so dangerous, we have to look objectively at Powell's legacy.
Right. Let's look at the numbers. In the year 2020, under Powell's direct leadership, the Federal Reserve inflated the United States money supply by roughly 25% in a single calendar year.
Which is just an unbelievable number to wrap your head around. The M2 money supply spiked from about $15 trillion to over $22 trillion.
And every single person listening to this felt the brutal reality of that decision at the grocery store and the gas pump.
Oh, absolutely. It triggered rampant, crushing inflation that Powell infamously and entirely falsely labeled as transitory.
The underlying mechanism there is the quantity theory of money.
Walk us through that.
If you think of the economy as a seesaw, with the total amount of money on one side and the total amount of physical goods on the other, They have to balance out to determine prices.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you increase the money supply by 25% while the physical production of goods stays flat, or worse, plummets due to supply chain lockdowns, the prices of those goods absolutely must rise to absorb the new currency.
Right. Now, the new regime coming in, Kevin Warsh and a recently resigned governor, Stephen Moran, they recognize they need to bring down long-term interest rates to manage this staggering national debt, right?
Yes, but they are trapped. If they just order the Fed to print more money to buy bonds and lower rates, that seesaw tips again, and inflation spikes.
So they're trapped in a financial escape room. They desperately need lower borrowing costs to keep the government functioning, but they can't fire up the Fed's money printer without triggering hyperinflation.
Exactly.
So what is the new magic trick? How do they conjure this necessary liquidity out of thin air without the Fed technically printing it?
Bank deregulation. This is the core strategic pivot the source identifies.
Okay, explain how that works, because the mechanics here are dense.
Sure. Following the 2008 financial crisis, massive regulatory frameworks like Basel III were implemented. These rules force private banks to hold a certain amount of highly safe assets, like U.S. treasuries.
Right, to prevent another meltdown.
Yes. But simultaneously, holding those treasuries counts against their supplementary leverage ratio, their risk limits.
Okay, so it essentially chokes off a bank's ability to lend money to the private sector if they are forced to hold too much government debt.
Correct. The incoming administration's plan is to completely deregulate this specific mechanism.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this right. The goal is to allow private banks, like JP Morgan, Bank of America, to buy an absolutely unlimited amount of U.S. government debt without those purchases counting against their risk limits.
That is the premise. By removing government debt from the risk-weighted asset calculation, you effectively allow the private banking sector to absorb the massive supply of U.S. treasuries.
So the private banks create the money to buy the debt through fractional reserve lending, rather than the Federal Reserve printing new base money.
Exactly. Because these massive treasury purchases no longer hit their regulatory limits, the banks simultaneously retain their full balance sheet capacity to unleash a historic lending boom into the private economy.
We're talking mortgages, auto loans, massive corporate debt expansion.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting, though. Heresy Financial points out a theoretical upside to this gamble.
Which is what?
If this massive tsunami of private bank lending actually fuels physical, tangible production, if companies use those loans to build millions of new houses, manufacture more cars, and extract more energy, the economic growth might actually balance out the seesaw.
Oh, I see. It's supply-side economics supercharged by deregulated liquidity.
Right. If the money supply expands through bank lending, but the sheer volume of physical goods in the economy expands at the exact same rate, consumer prices theoretically stay stable. It's a way to grow your way out of debt.
But the source warns that this is a colossal high-wire gamble.
Oh, massive. If that private lending boom flows into speculative assets, if it just inflates the stock market and housing prices without creating proportional physical production, it's just going to engineer another catastrophic financial bubble followed by an agonizing bust.
It's incredible when you view them side by side. The physicists are trying to pull picowatts out of a vacuum using mirrors, and the economists are trying to pull trillions of dollars out of thin air using deregulated bank ledgers.
Both disciplines are fundamentally trying to bypass the immutable laws of physical and economic scarcity.
And if the smartest people in our society are convincing themselves that energy and money can just be conjured through clever accounting, it's really no surprise that this exact same create-your-own-reality mindset is bleeding heavily into our culture.
Definitely. Once you remove the guardrails of objective physical reality at the institutional level, it creates a cascading effect.
Suddenly, biological, historical, and national realities are treated as mere subjective choices that can be customized at will.
Which moves us perfectly into the cultural layer of our deep dive.
Yeah, let's talk about the classroom audio. We have a source highlighted by the Secret Scholar Society, an organization run by Warren Smith.
This was intense to listen to.
It really was. It's a recording taken surreptitiously inside a middle school classroom in the United Kingdom, and honestly, it is one of the most jarring pieces of audio I've heard in a long time.
It captures a group of female students verbally clashing with their teacher because one of their classmates claims to literally identify as a cat.
A literal cat. And the dynamic in this recording is deeply revealing about modern institutional power, isn't it?
Absolutely. The students in the audio are arguing from a position of grounded, objective biology, and they are surprisingly articulate for middle schoolers.
Yeah, they openly acknowledge that biological anomalies exist, specifically citing intersex conditions, but they firmly state that these are chromosomal exceptions.
Right, and that there are fundamentally only two biological sexes.
Furthermore, they argue that if a human child genuinely believes they are a feline, it is indicative of profound mental unwellness, not a valid identity category that demands classroom affirmation.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Kids are weird. Middle schoolers go through bizarre phases. Isn't it possible the teacher is just trying to maintain classroom order and prevent a weird kid from being bullied?
Why is this audio considered such a massive cultural flashpoint?
Well, the source argues it's because it's not about the student's behavior, it's about the institution's epistemological demand.
Unpack that a bit. What do you mean by epistemological demand?
The teacher's reaction in the audio isn't to mediate a dispute. It is explosive and deeply authoritarian. She vehemently rejects the student's biological stance.
Right. She aggressively insists that gender and identity are entirely detached from physical reality.
And when the students politely but firmly hold their ground, the teacher threatens them with formal disciplinary action and expulsion.
Her exact words, captured on tape, were that objective biological reality is, quote, not an opinion that we express in this school.
Not an opinion that we express in the school. That is terrifying.
It is the raw exercise of institutional power to enforce a subjective illusion.
Yeah, the teacher isn't winning the debate on logical, biological, or even pedagogical grounds. She is demanding compliance to a manufactured reality by leveraging her authority over the students' academic futures.
When a public taxpayer-funded institution demands that a student's personal necessity to be a cat completely overrides observable biological truth, the shared boundaries of reality collapse entirely.
It teaches children that power dictates truth, not evidence.
I mean, if a student can just declare they are a cat, and the full weight of the school enforces it under threat of expulsion, where does the boundary line actually sit?
That's exactly the question.
And this fluid approach to reality isn't just happening in middle schools. It leads directly into our next source from Akkad Daily, which looks at how this exact same identity LARPing is playing out at the absolute highest levels of global politics.
Yeah, the Akkad Daily analysis focuses on Kemi Badenoch, who was recently elected as the new leader of the UK Conservative Party.
And what did she say that sparked this?
She gave an interview where she stated on the record that she, quote, no longer identifies as Nigerian.
This is despite the fact that she was born to Nigerian parents, holds a Nigerian heritage, and physically grew up in Nigeria until she was 16 years old.
Right. And the host of Akkad Daily heavily critiques this statement. He argues it represents a profound, almost cynical inauthenticity.
He draws a highly controversial but fascinating direct parallel between transgender ideology and what he terms transnational ideology.
Yeah, his core question is this. If a biological male can put on a dress, declare a new identity, and demand society agree he is no longer a man, how is that conceptually any different from a woman who grew up in West Africa telling the British public she no longer identifies with her foundational heritage just because she moved to London and won an election?
That is a heavy comparison.
It is. The source is launching a fundamental critique against civic nationalism.
For the listener, what is the source's definition of civic nationalism?
Civic nationalism is the modern political idea that national identity is purely propositional. It argues that being British or American or French is just about holding the right passport, obeying the local laws, and subscribing to a set of abstract values like freedom or democracy.
But the Akkad Daily argues that this is an elite illusion.
Exactly. It insists that true nationality and identity are deeply, inextricably tethered to biology, ethnicity, shared multi-generational history, and the physical cultural context of your upbringing.
But I have to push back on this on behalf of the listener because it strikes at the heart of the American experiment, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if an immigrant moves to a new country, say someone moves to Texas from halfway across the world, and they embrace the culture, they start eating barbecue, they wear the boots, they pledge allegiance to the flag, and they devote their life to the success of that community. Where is the line drawn between successfully assimilating into a new culture and, as the source claims, inauthentically erasing your past?
That is the exact tension the source is trying to highlight.
Isn't assimilation a good thing?
The argument from Akkad Daily isn't that cultural assimilation is impossible or bad. The argument is that complete historical erasure is impossible.
Ah, I see.
The source argues you carry your substrate with you.
Yeah.
You carry your childhood, your familial lineage, and your cultural bedrock. You cannot just mentally transition out of your foundational heritage, like changing a jacket to score political points with the conservative electorate.
Because it feels manufactured to the voters.
Right. The source claims that when politicians treat their very identity as a fluid, customizable product to be optimized for polling data, it breeds deep, corrosive cynicism among the public.
It's all connected. The quantum startup, the Federal Reserve, the middle school classroom, the parliament floor. These are all institutions demanding we pretend reality is whatever they declare it to be today.
And according to our next source from Basecamp, these modern global architectures themselves are totally divorced from physical reality.
Let's get into the Basecamp analysis. They offer a scathing macro-level critique of massive global entities like the United Nations and NATO.
Yeah, the source doesn't mince words. It describes these organizations as sprawling, bureaucratic, tumorous growths left over from a bygone era.
They argue these institutions were built for a 20th century reality that simply vanished decades ago, right?
To understand their critique, you have to look at why these entities were formed in the first place.
Walk us through their reasoning.
The UN and NATO were built for a world recovering from the absolute devastation of total mechanized war. They were designed to manage the aggressive expansion of the Soviet Union, and they operated in a world experiencing massive, explosive population booms.
But today, the source argues these institutions are artificially sustaining their own bureaucratic existence while completely ignoring modern geopolitical realities.
Specifically, they point out that these groups are ignoring the catastrophic demographic collapses happening across the developed Western world and the rapid shifting of global economic power toward the East.
They are essentially institutions running a 1945 legacy software program on a world that has completely changed its hardware.
That's a perfect analogy.
But wait, surely the counter-argument there is incredibly obvious right now. Look at Eastern Europe. Look at the invasion of Ukraine.
Right, the war.
Doesn't the presence of a massive land war in Europe prove that we need a defensive alliance like NATO more than ever? How does the source justify calling it a tumorous growth when artillery is literally firing in Europe?
The source's counterargument is that NATO's expansionist policies and rigid, outdated diplomatic frameworks actually exacerbate those conflicts rather than preventing them.
Okay, so they think the bureaucracy itself is the trigger.
They argue that these massive bureaucracies demand constant funding and existential threats to justify their own existence. The critique isn't necessarily that defense is bad. It's that a sprawling, centralized, ideological bureaucracy is the wrong tool for a world defined by asymmetrical warfare and shifting regional alliances.
It's an illusion of global stability that actually creates fragility.
Exactly.
Let's step back and look at the progression of what we've covered. We've talked about the illusion of infinite energy, the conjuring of deregulated money, the fluidity of biological and national identity, and the obsolescence of global institutions.
It's a lot.
But to sustain all these new, modern, subjective realities, you can't just change the present. You eventually have to go back and rewrite the foundational stories of the past so they legitimize the current narrative.
Which brings us to the deeply controversial realm of cultural preservation and history.
We have a source from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters regarding a reported new Hollywood adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey, allegedly being developed by director Christopher Nolan.
And the casting choices currently being discussed in the industry reports are causing an absolute firestorm online.
Right. According to the report cited by the source, the actor Elliot Page is cast as the legendary Greek warrior Achilles. Zendaya is playing the goddess Athena. Lupita Nyong'o is cast as Helen of Troy.
And the rapper Travis Scott is also involved in a major role, allegedly as a directorial nod to the academic idea that ancient oral poetry is culturally analogous to modern rap music.
The Lotus Eaters dedicate their analysis to heavily critiquing this project, describing it as deliberate cultural erasure and a profound subversion of foundational Western texts.
To understand the depth of their argument, we have to look past the Hollywood marketing and look at the historical text itself. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are not vague, abstract fairy tales.
Right, they are incredibly specific.
They're incredibly specific in their ethnography, their genealogy, and their physical descriptions.
The source actually brought up specific academic translations on screen during their show, didn't they?
Yes, they cited respected translations by scholars like Robert Fagles and Richmond Lattimore.
And what did the original text say?
In the original Greek text, Achilles is explicitly and repeatedly described as having fiery or golden blonde hair. Helen of Troy, considered the physical pinnacle of beauty in the ancient world, is repeatedly described with the highly specific epithet white-armed.
So the source argues that taking a foundational European epic, a story that serves as the absolute bedrock of Western literary civilization, and fundamentally altering the physical, ethnic, and cultural descriptors of its core heroes is not merely a matter of artistic license.
No, they say it is a deliberate ideological choice to impose 2026 American culture war dynamics onto ancient European history.
I can hear the counter-argument already, though. People will say, it's acting. We have dragons and gods in these movies. Why does hair color or skin color matter? It's just a story.
Sure, that's the standard defense.
But what's really compelling about the Lotus Eaters argument is that they completely bypass the it's just acting defense by pointing out a massive historical alternative.
This was a great point they made.
If Hollywood truly, genuinely cared about diversity, representation, and telling new stories, they don't need to race swap ancient Greek mythological figures to achieve it.
That is the crux of their point. The source points out that Hollywood could easily tell historically accurate, massive budget, epic stories about actual African kings and legends that interact with this exact same mythological universe.
They cite the story of Memnon, the king of Ethiopia. For listeners who aren't deep into Greek mythology, who was Memnon?
According to Greek mythology and ancient historical lore, Memnon was an African king who brought a massive, highly trained army to defend the city of Troy during the Trojan War.
So he was there during the events of the Iliad.
Yes, he was a legendary warrior, described in terms no less heroic or formidable than Hector. He actually fought Achilles in single combat.
So the obvious question becomes, if you have a $200 million budget, why not make an epic movie about Memnon? Why actively choose to overwrite the physical descriptions of Achilles and Helen?
The Lotus Eaters argue the answer is sinister.
Sinister how?
They argue it's because the goal of modern cultural institutions isn't actually to celebrate diverse history or elevate marginalized stories. The goal is to systematically dismantle, humiliate, and overwrite the specific history of the West so that it aligns with modern subjective realities.
This specific cultural friction raises a vital philosophical question, which our next source from Thinking West addresses directly.
Yes, if we are constantly rewriting our past, and if we can no longer agree on what our foundational stories even look like, how do we evaluate the health of our civilization?
The source poses a fascinating, almost unanswerable question. When exactly did Western civilization peak?
And it turns out, the answer completely depends on the metric you use to define objective reality.
The source takes us through a sweeping historical analysis, right? Let's break down the different eras they highlighted.
Sure, if your metric for a civilization's peak is absolute spiritual unity, architectural permanence, and scholastic achievement, the source points to the 1200s.
Okay, the 1200s. Why then?
This was the era of Thomas Aquinas, the agonizing multi-generational construction of the great Gothic cathedrals and a highly unified Catholic Europe.
But if your metric is the expansion of the Faustian soul, the answer changes completely.
Let's define that term for the listener.
Yeah, the Faustian soul is a concept from the philosopher Oswald Spengler. It describes the unique drive of Western civilization to constantly reach outward, to conquer the infinite, to explore beyond the horizon.
Right, it's the spirit that builds cathedrals reaching into the sky, builds ships to cross uncharted oceans, and eventually builds rockets to reach the moon.
Precisely. If that infinite drive is your metric, the source argues the peak was the 1500s during the Age of Discovery.
But if your metric is general political stability and peace across the European continent, it's the 1800s following the exhaustion of the Napoleonic Wars.
And if your metric is pure, affordable living conditions for the average working class person, like the ability to buy a home, raise a family on one income, and access cheap education, the peak was the 1950s in America.
And finally, if your defining metric is pure technological, medical, and scientific achievement, it is undeniably the late 1990s with the birth of the digital internet age.
So what is a takeaway from that historical whiplash?
The synthesis of this analysis is profound. It demonstrates that human civilization is not a straight upward trending line of unending progress.
It's ebbs and flows.
Exactly. It trades spiritual depth for technological breadth. And most importantly, the fundamental human condition remains an absolute constant.
The source evokes that famous quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." No era was a flawless utopia because humans are fundamentally inherently flawed.
But here's the terrifying part of all this.
What's that?
If we don't even agree on what our foundational stories are anymore, if Achilles is an actor from modern Hollywood, if the United Nations is acting like it's 1945, and if we are printing money like there is no tomorrow, how can we possibly know if we are at a peak or if we are descending rapidly into a valley?
We have entirely lost our civilizational yardstick.
Which leaves modern people in an incredibly precarious psychological position.
When your objective reality is erased, your biology is questioned, and your history is constantly overwritten, it creates a massive, echoing spiritual void.
You are left floating in a vacuum.
And that brings us to how people are frantically trying to fill that modern void and the false prophets who are more than happy to step up and guide them.
This moves us into a brilliant, deep analysis from the commentator Paul Vanderklay, who discusses what he calls the crushing burden of earthly happiness.
He traces this modern anxiety all the way back to the Enlightenment, doesn't he?
He does. And this is a crucial historical pivot point for understanding the modern psyche.
Walk us through that shift.
During the medieval period, the general societal and theological assumption was that true, final, ultimate happiness was completely unattainable in this life.
Right. The earthly realm was viewed as a fallen place of toil, duty, suffering, and spiritual preparation.
True joy was reserved for the afterlife. But the Enlightenment fundamentally shifted that paradigm. Philosophers began to move the concept of the holy city from heaven down to earth.
Meaning, if society gradually stops believing in an afterlife, all of your chips are pushed into the center of the table right now. You only get 80 years, and it has to be paradise.
Exactly. The modern secular assumption is that there is absolutely nothing after brain death. Therefore, the state, the prevailing culture, and the individual bear the absolutely crushing, impossible weight of achieving absolute utopian happiness in these few short years on Earth.
Vanderklay points out how this manifests in our daily lives, and it is eerily accurate.
Oh, it really is.
He argues it creates a morbid, terrified fear of aging. Because if youth, physical vitality, and earthly pleasure are the only tools you have to achieve happiness, getting older isn't a natural progression toward wisdom and elderhood.
No, it is a terrifying, irreversible decline into obsolescence. It breeds a culture of extreme, desperate individualism.
And it leads directly to a very specific, modern psychological pathology that Vanderklay highlights by quoting the physician and writer Theodore Dalrymple.
Right, Dalrymple calls it the cruelty of suspending judgment.
This was my favorite insight of the entire day's sources. Let's really deep dive into the cruelty of suspending judgment, because on the surface, it sounds like an oxymoron. We are constantly taught that judging people is cruel.
In a postmodern world where objective moral values have been erased, we are taught the maxim that facts are public but values are private.
So it's considered the ultimate social sin to impose your moral framework or judgment on someone else's personal pursuit of happiness.
Yes. And Vanderklay gives a hypothetical but very common example. Imagine a young woman making a terrible, life-altering decision.
Like what?
Perhaps she's pursuing botched, highly dangerous cosmetic surgery to chase an Instagram aesthetic, or perhaps she's falling into a severe pornography or substance addiction.
And her friends, who can clearly see she's destroying her life, are utterly terrified of being labeled judgmental, intolerant, or unsupportive.
So they say absolutely nothing. They watch her walk off a cliff, all in the name of respecting her private values and lived experience.
The source argues that this silence is not kindness, it is not tolerance. It is actually a form of deep moral cowardice, or even a disguised form of sadism.
Because when a society actively removes the guardrails of shared right and wrong, it abandons the most vulnerable people to figure out the universe entirely on their own.
It's like navigating a dark, incredibly dangerous forest without a map or a flashlight, and your friends are just standing safely on the edge of the woods yelling, "You do you! Walk right into that bear trap if it represents your authentic truth."
It is a brutal way to live.
But surely the conservative movement, which prides itself on objective truth, tradition, and shared values, is pushing back against this, right?
According to our next source, the cultural commentator Richard IV, the answer to that is a resounding, depressing no.
He provides a brutal analysis of the complete collapse of conservative cultural leadership, specifically looking at the fracturing of what used to be called the intellectual dark web.
Yeah, he uses a recent, highly publicized interview between the political commentator Dave Rubin and the Catholic Bishop Robert Barron as his prime example.
Now, for context for the listener, Dave Rubin recently utilized commercial surrogacy to procure 2 children for his gay marriage.
And Bishop Barron, who is arguably the most prominent, well-funded Catholic voice on the internet, sat down with him for a long-form interview.
The source is deeply, fundamentally critical of this interaction.
Extremely critical. Richard IV argues that a foundational tenet of the Christian tradition is speaking the truth, specifically regarding moral order and the nature of the family, even when it makes the room incredibly uncomfortable.
But in this interview, the source observes that the core, glaring moral conflicts between a Catholic bishop and a man utilizing surrogacy are completely bypassed.
Yeah, they bypass it in favor of discussing abstract, polite notions of civil discourse and shading wokeness.
Now, I know some listeners might be thinking, isn't civil discourse a good thing? Isn't it better that they are talking politely rather than screaming at each other on Twitter? Why does the source view this as a failure?
Because the source views it as cowardice masquerading as politeness. Richard IV calls this type of interaction a watered-down libertarian slop that entirely fails to address the real, bleeding cultural and moral decay happening in the West.
The critique is that these mainstream conservative figures are playing a 2015 game of polite country club disagreement while the underlying culture is in an absolute freefall.
Exactly. And the source makes a really brutal observation here. He says mainstream conservatives are essentially sitting around waiting for a magical return to a Christian Britain or a traditional 1950s America that simply does not exist anymore.
It's a phantom. They are trying to conserve a culture whose churches are entirely empty.
And nature absolutely abhors a vacuum. Into this gaping spiritual and cultural void step the false prophets of the modern digital age.
Because mainstream tradition has abandoned its moral authority to play nice, the source points to figures like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes, who are more than happy to fill the void for young men.
Right. Tate is out there on podcasts literally saying that systemic issues or racism aren't real. It's just poor people fighting each other, and that true ultimate enlightenment is sitting on a 42-meter super yacht in Bodrum, Turkey, smoking a cigar.
These figures offer nothing but pure, unadulterated materialist hedonism, hyper-competitiveness, and massive, unchecked ego.
But here's the trick. They mask it as traditionalism. They package it as a rebellion against the liberal world order.
In reality, the source argues they are just the right-wing variant of the exact same materialist rot.
They win over millions of young, deeply lost men because the traditional structures, the true archetypal fathers, the grounded local communities, have collapsed, leaving only the edgy older brother with a Rolex and an internet connection to tell them how the universe works.
It really is like driving a high-performance car with a GPS that has completely lost its satellite connection. We are moving incredibly fast. We have all this technological speed, but we have absolutely zero absolute coordinates.
We're just doing donuts in a parking lot, pretending it's a journey.
And when people realize the map is completely blank, they start looking for answers in very strange, very dark places.
Which leads us into the most bizarre, yet strangely inevitable portion of our deep dive. The unseen realm.
Yeah, when traditional spiritual anchors are severed and physical reality feels entirely manufactured by politicians and bankers, people don't just stop believing, they start believing in anything.
They turn their eyes to the literal skies.
Let's talk about UFOs. The Theology podcast source discusses a wild, sweeping rumor that is currently tearing through certain religious and conspiracy circles.
This was fascinating. Apparently, a group of prominent Pentecostal pastors were recently invited to a highly classified secret briefing by alleged intelligence officials at an Airbnb in Tennessee.
Just the setup alone sounds like a movie. And the rumor states they were explicitly told to prepare their congregations for an impending, undeniable disclosure day regarding non-human intelligences, or NHIs.
Now, whether this specific clandestine meeting in Tennessee actually happened exactly as described is almost secondary to the massive cultural phenomenon it represents.
Right. The hosts of the podcast, who are serious theologians, take the premise seriously and break down the 3 distinct possibilities for what these NHIs could actually be, assuming the phenomena people are witnessing in the skies are real.
Let's walk through those options. Option 1 is the Hollywood standard. They are literal space aliens, extraterrestrial biological entities from another planet in our universe who figured out interstellar travel.
Option 2 gets weirder. They are interdimensional beings. They are slipping into our reality from a parallel quantum dimension. which supposedly solves the physics problem of traveling faster than the speed of light.
Right, they aren't crossing space, they are crossing dimensions.
And option 3, which is gaining serious, rigorous traction not just among fringe theologians, but even among some secular researchers. These entities are demonic.
That is a massive, terrifying leap. How do serious thinkers justify the demonic theory for flying saucers?
They reference the work of foundational researchers like Jacques Vallée, a highly respected secular computer scientist and astronomer.
What did Vallée find?
Vallée spent decades analyzing UFO encounters and noted that they closely mirror ancient folklore. In the past, when humanity was agricultural, people saw fairies, elves, or glowing angels in the woods. Today, in a hyper-technological aerospace age, we see metallic ships and gray aliens.
So the phenomena shapeshifts to match the cultural expectations of the era.
Exactly. They also reference Diana Pasulka, an academic who studies how modern Silicon Valley tech elites literally claim to receive downloads of technological blueprints from these non-human intelligences during meditation or psychedelic states.
But wait, I have to stop you there. If these things are demons, how do they have technology? How does a demon build a titanium spaceship that evades radar?
I know, I always thought of demons as just, immaterial spiritual forces that possess people, not aerospace engineers.
This is where the podcast brings up a fascinating deep dive into the biblical history of technology. They note that in the ancient biblical narrative, it was the specific descendants of Cain who developed metallurgy, advanced weaponry, and complex tools.
Oh, that's interesting.
Furthermore, in ancient apocryphal texts like 1st Enoch, fallen angels, known as the Watchers, are explicitly described as descending to earth and teaching humanity the forbidden secrets of weapon-making, cosmetics, root cuttings, and sorcery.
So the theological argument is that the demonic realm cannot create biological life out of nothing, which only God can do, but they possess vast, ancient knowledge of the natural physical world and can manipulate it through technology.
Right, through techne. But the podcast hosts also float a much more earthly and perhaps more politically terrifying possibility.
Which is what?
What if there are no aliens and there are no demons flying spaceships? What if this entire UFO disclosure narrative is an elaborate, multi-decade government psychological operation? A massive psyop.
To understand how that could work, we have to define modern military doctrines, specifically fifth-generation warfare.
Explain that for the listeners.
For those unfamiliar, first-generation warfare was lines of men with muskets. Second was industrial artillery. Third was maneuver warfare, like blitzkrieg. Fourth was insurgency and guerrilla tactics.
And fifth-generation
warfare completely leaves the physical battlefield. It is the weaponization of information and perception. It occurs entirely in the cognitive domain.
So it's about breaking a society's ability to agree on what is real, so they defeat themselves without a single physical bullet being fired.
Exactly. In a world where direct nuclear war is too costly, warfare has shifted to manipulating reality. If an intelligence agency, foreign or domestic, wanted to inject a massive, destabilizing narrative into the public consciousness to gauge societal reaction, track how information spreads, or simply distract the populace from massive economic failures.
Feeding a sci-fi UFO narrative to a group of enthusiastic, highly influential pastors is an incredibly efficient, low-cost way to execute it.
It is the ultimate manufactured illusion. But if we assume for a moment that the unseen, spiritual realm is real and demonic forces are active, how is a normal person supposed to interact with that reality?
Our next source, a sermon from Saints Peter and Paul Orthodox Church, provides a very stern, very grounded warning about the distraction of the demonic.
The priest in this sermon focuses on a specific, fascinating story from the biblical book of Acts, chapter 16.
The Apostle Paul is walking through a city and is followed for days by a slave girl who is possessed by a spirit of divination.
And the demon inside her is yelling something that is entirely factually true. She is yelling, "These men are servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation."
I always found that story confusing. Why would a demon yell the absolute truth about Paul? That seems entirely counterproductive to a demon's goals.
The priest explains the mechanism behind this manipulation perfectly. He says that demons will gladly tell you 99 absolute truths just to get you to lower your defenses and swallow one fatal lie.
They speak truth to gain your trust.
Right. If the early Christians trusted the demon because it accurately validated Paul, they might be tricked into following the possessed girl's prophecies after Paul left town.
The ultimate goal of demonic influence, whether it manifests through intrusive thoughts, incredibly vivid dreams, or even the seemingly miraculous lining up of life circumstances, is always to build spiritual pride.
It is to make you think you are special, that you possess secret knowledge, or that you have a unique destiny.
The priest actually shared a crazy personal anecdote about that in the audio, didn't he?
He did. He recounted a time early in his ministry when circumstances in his life lined up absolutely perfectly to move to a new, prestigious parish. Every door opened, every obstacle vanished, and it felt entirely, undeniably, divinely ordained.
And then what happened?
At the very last possible minute, the entire situation violently and messily fell apart. When he went to his older, wiser spiritual father to ask why God would tease him like that, the older priest simply looked at him and said, "Demons can make miracles too."
Wow. Demons can make miracles too. That completely upends how most people view spiritual signs.
So what is the defense mechanism against an enemy that can fake miracles and tell the truth?
The orthodox advice is brutally, beautifully simple. Ignore them.
Just ignore them.
Yeah. Do not put your trust in vivid dreams, do not obsess over intrusive thoughts, and do not trust overly perfect, synchronistic circumstances.
The priest argues that paying too much attention to demons or UFOs or grand sweeping internet conspiracies gives them power over your mind.
The traditional approach is to aggressively ignore the distraction and focus entirely on the grounded reality of Christ and your immediate neighbor. You make your spiritual life their affliction, rather than letting their illusions become your reality.
Which ties perfectly into our next theological source from St. Andrew Orthodox Christian Church. If we shouldn't trust demonic illusions, this priest warns against turning God himself into an illusion.
He warns against turning the divine into what he calls a magic vending machine.
The sermon tackles the very common modern misconception of praying in Jesus' name.
The priest argues that modern, highly materialized Christians often treat that phrase as a magic incantation, like waving a wand.
You ask for a new job, a bigger house, a more attractive spouse. You tack in Jesus' name onto the end of the sentence, and you expect the creator of the universe to obey your command like a cosmic butler.
He literally calls this practice orthopaganism.
Because the underlying mechanism is pagan. The fundamental nature of magic, whether ancient sorcery or modern manifestation techniques, is about imposing your own ego onto the universe.
It's about manipulating unseen power to achieve your own material ends.
True faith, the priest argues, is the exact polar opposite. It is about aligning your will with the divine will, regardless of the outcome.
It is not about treating God as a tool to feed your material desires. It is about accepting objective reality as it is given to you, embracing the suffering that comes with it, and finding grace within that struggle.
Okay, we have spent a massive amount of time in the weeds today. We have analyzed quantum physics scams, global banking deregulation, student identifying as cats, Hollywood race-swapping ancient history, the crushing burden of secular happiness, and the possibility of interdimensional demons flying UFOs.
It's a lot to process.
If you are listening to this, it is incredibly easy to feel completely unmoored, like nothing is real and everything is a psyop. But I want to aggressively contrast all of this esoteric high-level speculation with some raw, undeniable, concrete reality.
This brings us to a source from the Your Calvinist podcast, detailing the ongoing work of the Mission Aviation Fellowship, or MAF, operating out in the deep jungles of the Congo.
This is what objective physical reality actually looks like.
Yeah, these missionaries operate small, rugged airplanes in one of the most dangerous, unforgiving environments on Earth.
They are taking what is normally a highly dangerous, grueling 30-day physical trek up the muddy banks of the Congo River, and they're turning it into a 4-hour flight.
They are carrying 2,000 pounds of absolutely vital gear per flight. They are moving local pastors, critical medical supplies, and emergency food into completely remote, cut-off areas.
And what are they asking for? Let's look at the contrast. They aren't asking for a $12 million venture capital check to build a magical quantum microchip. They aren't printing trillions of dollars.
They are seeking 20 families to give exactly $100 a month to reach their bare minimum funding.
They are trying to buy physical deep freezes to store 2 weeks of emergency food rations for when the region inevitably goes into violent security lockdowns. They are raising money for physical, tangible solar panels to keep those freezers running when the local power grid fails.
The contrast is absolutely staggering. While the hyper-developed Western world is paralyzing itself, debating whether biological sex is real, or whether the government is hiding aliens, or whether Christopher Nolan is ruining Homer.
There are people dealing with the raw, unforgiving mechanics of daily survival and spiritual mission. Buying aviation fuel, installing solar panels, sweating in the jungle, saving actual human lives.
True reality is found in actionable, grounded purpose.
You want to know what's real? A 2,000-pound payload of medical supplies landing on a dirt airstrip in the jungle is real. And if you want one final jarring example of reality kicking the door down on our postmodern illusions, we have our final geopolitical update.
We turn to an analysis from Asmongold TV, who is reviewing live, unedited footage and military reports of ongoing Ukrainian drone strikes deep inside Russian territory.
This footage is insane. You have to understand the scale of what is happening. Ukraine is actively flying drones, which are essentially built out of composite materials and commercial electronics, costing roughly $600 each, hundreds of kilometers into the Moscow region.
They are striking massive, multi-billion-dollar Russian oil refineries right in the middle of the day.
From a pure military analysis perspective, this proves the complete systemic inadequacy of Russian air defenses.
The mechanism here is fascinating. How does a cheap drone bypass a superpower's radar?
Because they fly incredibly low, they are made of radar-absorbent composite materials, and they have a tiny radar cross-section.
The concentration of sophisticated S-400 air defense systems around Moscow is supposed to be the highest in the country, yet these slow-moving, relatively cheap drones are penetrating the airspace and hitting critical economic infrastructure.
As the host of the video points out with a heavy dose of irony, Russia's 3-day special military operation is now entering its 4th grinding year.
It is a profound, brutal geopolitical reality check.
We are watching a superpower with massive nuclear capabilities and a theoretically overwhelming mechanized military being economically and psychologically bled out by a smaller, technologically adaptable force using asymmetrical warfare.
Ukraine is using sheer volume to exhaust Russian defenses, forcing the Russian military to expend million-dollar advanced interceptor missiles just to shoot down a $600 drone. The math is entirely unsustainable for Moscow.
Physical kinetic war does not care about your postmodern worldview. It doesn't care about your bespoke identity politics, your complex economic theories, or your culture wars.
It is the ultimate arbiter of truth.
A drone strike detonating on an oil refinery is the brutal objective reality crashing the manufactured illusion.
Let's pull all of these massive threads together to find the core message of the day.
Today on the show, we started by exposing the illusion of infinite energy from quantum vacuums and infinite money from deregulated banking.
We watched how the collapse of objective biological truth is playing out in our middle schools and how historical truth is being rewritten in Hollywood.
We analyzed the deep, terrifying spiritual void that modern society has created, which is now being filled by UFO psychological operations and false internet prophets.
And we ended with the brutal, undeniable reality of kinetic warfare.
The overarching theme is incredibly clear and incredibly urgent. When a society actively detaches itself from objective reality, when it arrogantly believes it can conjure physical resources, biological identities, and foundational history out of thin air to suit its feelings, it becomes incredibly dangerously vulnerable.
It becomes vulnerable to massive economic collapse, to deep cultural decay, to sophisticated psychological operations, and ultimately to devastating physical conflict. Reality always, eventually, collects its debts.
So, as promised, every single day on the Morning Roundup, we don't just leave you drowning in the bad news. We give you practical, actionable steps to respond to the day's insights and protect yourself.
Step 1. Audit your reality. You need to ruthlessly and critically examine the institutions, the politicians, and the voices you give your trust to. Stop giving your attention, your votes, and your money to entities that promise you something from nothing.
Whether that is a tech startup promising perpetual energy, a central bank printing infinite liquidity, or a cultural movement promising utopian happiness without sacrifice, demand objective, verifiable proof.
Step 2. Anchor yourself. Stop playing the identity LARPing games. You cannot build a stable, resilient life on subjective fluidity. Find grounded, historical, biological, and spiritual truths to root your family in.
Don't be afraid to be the person in the room, in the classroom, in the boardroom, or at the dinner table who calmly stands up and says, no, 2 + 2 = 4, and the sky is blue.
Step 3. Do tangible good. It is so incredibly easy to get paralyzed in the endless digital labyrinth of internet conspiracy theories, UFO lore, and political outrage. Turn off the screen. Find a concrete physical mission in the real world.
Support people who are doing actual work, like the MAF missionaries keeping freezers running in the Congo, or local charities operating in your own zip code. Put your physical hands to work on something that is undeniably real.
And as we close out today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
We spent a lot of time discussing the possibility of non-human intelligences and government psyops. But ask yourself this. If a highly advanced, genuinely extraterrestrial or interdimensional intelligence did actually reveal itself to the world tomorrow,
Would our modern society, a society that currently cannot even agree on basic human biology, foundational history, or simple economics, even possess the mental framework to survive that encounter without losing its collective mind entirely?
if our grip on shared reality is already this fragile, a true paradigm shift might just shatter our civilization completely.
Let us know how you feel about these realities in the comments. We promised we wouldn't hold back today, and we know some of this challenged your worldview.
But pushing buttons and challenging assumptions is exactly what a good talk show is supposed to do. We highly encourage you to check out the links to all the original sources we discussed today in the show notes so you can go deeper into these arguments yourself and verify the truth.
If you found value in this deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this show with someone in your life who desperately needs a reality check.
You can't spend a counterfeit $20 bill forever. Eventually, someone is going to check the watermark. Be the person who checks the watermark. We will see you tomorrow on the next Morning Roundup.